What if I told you that the most feared figures in medieval folklore, witches, were not born from ancient pagan traditions or diabolic pacts, but from the calculating minds of judges who saw profit in persecution? That behind every pointed hat and bubbling cauldron of legend lay not supernatural power, but the very earthly hunger for gold that drove respected men of law to fabricate an industry of terror? As the sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows over the cobbled streets of a medieval village, let us journey back to an era steeped in mystery and fear. The Middle Ages, spanning the 5th to the 15th centuries in Europe. This was a time of flickering torchlight dancing against stone walls, of whispered prayers echoing through cathedral arches, and the ever-present specter of the unknown lurking in every forest grove and abandoned cottage. Among the tales of knights and kings, crusades and plagues, a darker story unfolds, one that reveals how the very concept of witchcraft, as we know, it was systematically crafted not by sorcery, but by the cunning hands of judges seeking to line their purses with silver. In this immersive exploration, we delve into the shadowed corridors of medieval justice, uncovering how fear, faith, and greed wove a tapestry of persecution that enriched the powerful while destroying the innocent. We will walk through moonlit village squares where accusations whispered in darkness could transform a neighbor into a monster, where the pointing finger of suspicion carried more weight than any evidence, and where the sound of coins clinking in judicial coffers often drowned out the cries of the condemned. Picture, if you will, a medieval courtroom in the dead of winter. Snow piles against leaded windows while inside. A fire crackles in the hearth, casting dancing shadows that seem to mock the proceedings. The stone walls, thick enough to muffle screams, echo with the testimony of witnesses whose words carry the weight of life and death. Here, judges cloaked in the authority of both crown and cross sit at the helm of justice, their gavels falling like thunder against oak tables worn smooth by centuries of verdicts. But beneath their somber robes and scholarly facades lay a motive far less righteous than the pursuit of divine justice: the relentless hunger for profit. The witch as a figure of terror and persecution was not born of ancient magic or diabolic intervention, but of a calculated design to exploit humanity's deepest fears and superstitions. These learned men of law discovered that accusations of witchcraft provided a perfect mechanism for seizing property, extracting confessions through torture, and demanding payment for their services as purifiers of Christian society. Each trial became a carefully orchestrated performance where the outcome was predetermined, the profits calculated, and the human cost dismissed as collateral damage in the service of a greater good. Consider the mechanics of this medieval money-making machine. When a woman was accused of witchcraft, and it was overwhelmingly women who faced these charges, her property immediately became subject to seizure. Her livestock, her cottage, her meager savings, even her clothing and household goods could be claimed by the court before any verdict was rendered. The judges charged fees for their services, the torturers demanded payment for their expertise, and the executioners expected compensation for their grisly work. Every step of the process generated revenue, creating a financial incentive to pursue ever more cases, to extract ever more confessions, and to expand the definition of witchcraft to encompass an ever wider net of potential victims. The accused found themselves trapped in a web of legal procedures designed to ensure their guilt. If they confessed under torture, they validated the court's suspicions and justified the seizure of their property. If they refused to confess, their stubborn silence was interpreted as further evidence of their diabolic allegiance. If they named accomplices, as tortured souls inevitably did, they provided the court with new victims to pursue. The system was self-perpetuating, each trial generating both the funds and the justification for the next. But this was not merely a story of individual greed run amok. The invention of the witch as a legal and economic category required the collaboration of multiple institutions and the creation of an entire intellectual framework to support it. Legal scholars wrote treatises detailing the signs of witchcraft, the proper procedures for detection, and the theological justifications for persecution. The Church provided the moral authority that transformed what might have been seen as mere superstition into a matter of cosmic significance. Local authorities found in which trials a convenient tool for maintaining social order and eliminating troublesome individuals who challenged established hierarchies. As we wander through this shadowed history, we will encounter the lives shattered by these machinations, the village healers whose knowledge of herbs marked them as dangerous, the widows whose independence threatened patriarchal order, the outcasts whose very existence reminded others of society's failures. Their stories, preserved in trial records and chroniclers' accounts, reveal the human cost of transforming fear into profit, of weaponizing faith for financial gain. The legacy of these medieval innovations in judicial capitalism extended far beyond the Middle Ages themselves. The legal precedents established, the investigative techniques refined, and the social dynamics unleashed would echo through centuries of persecution, from the witch trials of early modern Europe to the witch panics of colonial America. Understanding how medieval judges invented witches to grow rich illuminates not just a distant historical phenomenon, but a pattern of how power operates, how fear can be monetized, and how the vulnerable become currency in the calculations of the ambitious. So join me, dear listener, as we illuminate these forgotten corners of history together. Subscribe to uncover more untold stories where greed masqueraded as justice, where the powerful preyed upon the powerless, and where the echoes of medieval avarice still whisper warnings relevant to our modern world. Let us lift the veil on these shadows of the past, for only by understanding how darkness once operated can we better recognize when it creeps into our own time. Close your eyes and let the whispers of the past guide you into this tale of avarice and anguish, as we unravel the calculated creation of one of history's most enduring myths, and discover why medieval judges invented witches to grow rich. Now that we understand the economic machinery that drove witch persecution, we must examine the psychological and spiritual landscape that made such exploitation possible. For no matter how calculating the judges, no matter how systematic their profit-seeking, they could not have succeeded without a society primed to believe in the reality of supernatural evil walking among them. In the medieval world, where the church's spires pierced the heavens like stone prayers, and the turning of seasons dictated not just prosperity, but survival itself, fear was more than an emotion. It was a constant companion that shaped every aspect of daily existence. As we walk through the muddy lanes of a typical village, our boots squelching in the mixture of rain, animal waste, and decomposing organic matter that formed the roads, we can almost taste the unease that permeated the very air. This was fear of famine, when the harvest might fail and children would starve before spring's return. Fear of plague, which could sweep through a community like wildfire. leaving behind empty houses and orphaned children. Fear of war, of raiders, of the capricious nature of feudal lords who might demand impossible taxes or conscript sons for distant battles they would never return from. But perhaps most pervasive of all was the fear of the unseen forces that medieval people believed governed their world. The invisible realm where angels and demons waged eternal war for human souls. The Church, standing as both a spiritual and often literal center of medieval life, preached with thunderous certainty that the devil lurked in every shadow, prowled every forest path, and whispered temptations into every ear. This was not metaphorical language to the medieval mind. It was stark, terrifying reality. Satan was as real as the priest delivering the sermon, as present as the crucifix hanging above the altar, as immediate as the threat of eternal damnation. Into this fertile ground of superstition and terror, judges and authorities planted the seeds of the witch myth with the careful precision of farmers sowing grain. They understood that a society already primed to believe in supernatural evil would readily accept that such evil had human collaborators. The witch became the perfect scapegoat for society's woes, a tangible target for intangible fears, and most importantly for our story, a renewable resource that would yield a harvest of wealth for those clever enough to cultivate it. The Christian doctrine of the time painted a cosmos starkly divided between the forces of good and evil, with humanity caught in the middle of this cosmic battlefield. Within this framework, women were consistently portrayed as the weaker vessels, more susceptible to Satan's wiles due to their supposedly inferior spiritual and intellectual nature. The biblical tale of Eve, who succumbed to the serpent's temptation in the Garden of Eden, was invoked repeatedly to justify suspicions of female frailty and moral weakness. This wasn't merely theological speculation. It was legal precedent, used to argue that women were inherently more likely to enter into pacts with the devil. Consider the theological reasoning that underpinned this gendered persecution. Medieval scholars, drawing on ancient Greek philosophy and early Christian writings, argued that women's bodies were naturally colder and more humid than men's, making them more susceptible to demonic influence. Their supposed emotional instability, their connections to childbirth and menstruation, both mysterious processes that medieval medicine poorly understood, and their traditional roles as healers and midwives all became evidence of their potential for supernatural corruption. The very qualities that made women valuable to their communities, their knowledge of herbs, their ability to ease pain, their understanding of the mysteries of birth and death, were reframed as dangerous proximities to forbidden knowledge. When crops failed due to poor weather or plant disease, when livestock sickened from unknown ailments, when children died of illnesses that had no visible cause, whispers of witchcraft spread through communities like wildfire. The medieval mind, lacking scientific explanations for natural phenomena, found comfort in supernatural ones. It was easier to blame a neighbor's curse than to accept the randomness of disaster. It was more satisfying to identify a human enemy than to rail against an indifferent universe. These whispers didn't arise spontaneously. They were carefully cultivated by those who stood to benefit from them. Local priests, many of whom were as ignorant as their parishioners but far more politically savvy, learned to direct communal anxiety toward useful targets. Village leaders, seeking to maintain their authority in times of crisis, found scapegoats more effective than actual solutions. And judges, those supposedly impartial arbiters of justice, saw opportunity in every accusation. The process often began with what medieval legal documents called common fame, persistent rumors about an individual's supernatural activities. Perhaps a woman had been seen gathering herbs at dawn, or muttering to herself while walking alone, or simply living too independently for community comfort. Perhaps she had argued with a neighbor shortly before that neighbor's cow died, or had been present at a difficult childbirth that ended in tragedy. In a world where correlation was routinely mistaken for causation, these coincidences became evidence of supernatural malice. Judges, often aligned with the church hierarchy or local lords through complex webs of patronage and mutual benefit, saw golden opportunity in these fears. By labeling dissenters, outcasts, or the economically vulnerable as witches, they could achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. They could seize property through legal confiscation, demand substantial fines from the accused or their families, assert control over troublesome individuals, and present themselves as protectors of Christian society, all under the unassailable guise of divine justice. The genius of this system lay in its apparent legitimacy. Unlike simple theft or arbitrary persecution, which trials followed established legal procedures, they referenced scriptural authority. They employed scholarly language and complex theological arguments. They created an entire bureaucracy of specialists, inquisitors, torturers, executioners, whose expertise lent credibility to the proceedings. Most importantly, they transformed what might have been seen as obvious greed into religious duty. Imagine, if you will, a widow living on the edge of town, her small cottage surrounded by the herb garden that provides both her livelihood and her neighbor's suspicion. Once, her remedies were valued, her knowledge of which plants could ease a fever, which could help a difficult labor, which could calm a restless child. But as paranoia grows and economic pressures mount, her expertise becomes evidence of diabolic knowledge. The very herbs that once marked her as a healer now brand her as a sorceress in the eyes of those who seek to profit from her destruction. Or consider a village healer whose knowledge of plants and their properties raised suspicion in a priest's heart, not because he genuinely believed in her supernatural powers, but because her independence and influence threatened his authority. Her ability to provide comfort and healing without recourse to church sacraments made her a competitor in the spiritual marketplace. Her economic independence made her property attractive to those who controlled the legal system. These were the primary targets of witch persecution. Women and men whose marginal status made them easy prey for accusations, whose lack of powerful protectors made them vulnerable to legal assault, and whose modest property made them attractive targets for confiscation. The poor were too destitute to be worth pursuing, the wealthy too well-connected to be safely attacked. But those in between, the small property owners, the skilled craftspeople, the independent women, they occupied the sweet spot where profit and vulnerability intersected. The church's official position on witchcraft was codified in texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, a 15th century treatise that declared witchcraft not just a crime against God, but a threat to the very fabric of Christian civilization. This document, written by inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, provided judges with detailed instructions for identifying, trying, and executing witches. More importantly for our story, it legitimized the financial incentives that drove persecution by framing material gain as spiritual reward, the just profits of those who defended Christianity against its supernatural enemies. armed with such authoritative texts, judges transformed superstition into a legal weapon of unprecedented effectiveness. They created a system where fear generated profit, where community anxiety could be harvested as efficiently as grain, and where the very bonds of neighborly trust became currency in the marketplace of persecution. The witch trial became more than a judicial proceeding. It became a carefully orchestrated performance where the outcome was predetermined, the profits calculated, and the human cost dismissed as necessary collateral in the service of a greater good. As we drift deeper into this tale of calculated cruelty, let the weight of these fears linger in your mind like morning mist over a graveyard. Remember how easily belief and greed intertwined to birth not just the witch as a figure of terror, but the entire industry of persecution that would stain European history for centuries to come. For an understanding how fear was weaponized in medieval courtrooms, we begin to comprehend the true scope of judicial ambition and the devastating efficiency with which human suffering was transformed into gold. Having explored the fertile ground of fear that made witch persecution possible, we now turn to examine the intricate machinery of profit that transformed superstition into systematic exploitation. For it was not enough merely to have a society primed to believe in supernatural evil. That belief had to be harvested, refined, and converted into tangible wealth through the carefully orchestrated theater of the witch trial. Step with me into the dimly lit halls of a medieval courtroom, where flickering candles cast dancing shadows on stone walls that have witnessed countless confessions extracted through agony. The air hangs thick with more than just tension. It carries the acrid scent of burning tallow mixed with the metallic tang of fierce sweat and the lingering aroma of the herbs used to mask the smell of unwashed bodies packed into the gallery. Here, in this sanctified space where justice was supposedly administered, judges orchestrated a grim theater of accusation and punishment that would have impressed the most calculating merchants of their age. The witch trials were never merely a quest for justice, despite the elaborate legal rituals that surrounded them. They were, from their very inception, a lucrative enterprise designed to enrich those with the power to manipulate the levers of law and faith. From the moment an accusation was whispered in a tavern or shouted in a village square, the machinery of profit began to turn with the relentless precision of a mill wheel, grinding down the accused while filling the purses of the accusers with gold extracted from human misery. The process was deceptively simple, yet brutally effective in its design. An accusation, often sparked by a neighbor's grudge, a business dispute, or most cynically, a judge's careful prompting of suggestible witnesses, led immediately to arrest. The accused, stripped not only of their freedom, but of virtually all legal rights, faced interrogation designed not to uncover truth, but to extract the confessions that would justify their destruction. The presumption of innocence, that cornerstone of justice we take for granted today, was turned completely on its head in witch trials. The accused bore the burden of proving their innocence, an impossible task when the very act of defending oneself could be interpreted as evidence of diabolic defiance. Consider the perverse logic that governed these proceedings. If the accused confessed readily, their confession proved their guilt. If they maintained their innocence, their stubbornness was evidence of supernatural assistance in resisting divine justice. If they wept and begged for mercy, their tears were dismissed as crocodile tears shed by creatures without souls. If they remained stoic and dignified, Their composure was interpreted as the unnatural calm granted by demonic powers. Every possible response was twisted into evidence of guilt, creating a legal labyrinth for which escape was not merely difficult, but literally impossible. The tools of persuasion employed in these trials would have been familiar to any merchant seeking to extract the maximum price for a reluctant customer, albeit applied with infinitely more cruelty. The rack, that devilish machine of wooden rollers and ropes, could stretch a human body until joints popped from their sockets and muscles tore like worn fabric. The witch's chair, bristling with iron spikes, ensured that even the act of sitting became an agony that mounted with each passing hour. The strappado, which hoisted victims by their arms bound behind their backs, could dislocate shoulders and leave the tortured permanently crippled. These instruments served a dual purpose. They extracted the confessions that legitimized the legal proceedings, and they served as terrifying advertisements of what awaited anyone who might consider challenging the system. Each trial required an elaborate network of fees that flowed like tributaries into the main river of judicial profit. The scribe who recorded the proceedings demanded payment for his services, charging by the page and taking care to write in an expansive hand that maximized the volume of his work. The jailer expected compensation for housing and feeding the accused, though the quality of both accommodation and nutrition barely rose above what might be provided to livestock. The executioner, skilled in the grim arts of torture and death, commanded substantial fees for his expertise, with additional charges for the use of specialized equipment and the disposal of remains. But these were merely the obvious costs. The true genius of the system lay in its hidden expenses, each one carefully calculated to extract maximum profit while maintaining the facade of legitimate legal procedure. Witnesses required compensation for their time and testimony, with the most damaging testimony naturally commanding the highest fees. Expert witnesses, typically clergy or scholars who could provide learned opinions on the theological implications of the accused alleged crimes, expected substantial payment for lending their authority to the proceedings. Even the wood for the execution pyre was charged to the accused estate, ensuring that victims literally paid for their own destruction. The financial architecture of witch trials was designed to be self-perpetuating. The accused, stripped of their property from the moment of arrest, had no means to mount an effective defense. Their assets were held in trust by the very court that would ultimately judge them, creating an obvious conflict of interest that nonetheless went unchallenged. If convicted, and conviction rates approached universality, the witch's property was confiscated in its entirety, typically divided among the judge, the church hierarchy, and local lords according to predetermined formulas that ensured everyone with power had a stake in the system's continuation. In some regions, particularly within the fragmented territories of the Holy Roman Empire, judges earned direct bonuses for each conviction they secured. These performance incentives transformed witch trials from judicial proceedings into something resembling a medieval equivalent of commission sales, where the product being sold was human suffering and the currency was confiscated property. The more witches a judge could identify and condemn, the more lucrative his position became, creating a feedback loop that inevitably led to mass trials and widespread persecution. The scale of this systematic looting becomes clear when we examine specific historical cases. Picture, if you will, a prosperous village in the German countryside, its fields golden with grain, and its market square bustling with commerce. Within the space of a single year, following the arrival of an ambitious witch-hunting judge, that same village could be transformed into a hollow shell of its former self. Fields lay fallow because their owners had been executed as witches, their property seized by the court. Market stalls stood empty because the merchants who once operated them had been denounced by neighbors seeking to eliminate competition. Families huddled in poverty because the breadwinners had been consumed by a legal machine designed to extract wealth from human flesh. The city of Bamberg, in what is now southern Germany, provides perhaps the most stark example of how witch trials functioned as engines of economic devastation. During the early 17th century, under the rule of Prince Bishop Julius Ector and his successor Gottfried Johann Georg Fuchs Dornheim, the city experienced a witch craze that consumed nearly 1,000 victims over the course of several decades. The wealth accumulated from these trials funded lavish construction projects, sumptuous court ceremonies, and the personal fortunes of judges who had transformed the administration of justice into a highly profitable enterprise. The trial of a single witch could generate enough revenue to fund a judge's lavish lifestyle for months. Consider the case of a moderately prosperous merchant's widow, accused of causing her neighbor's livestock to sicken through supernatural means. Her modest house, her small shop, her carefully hoarded savings, her household goods, all would be inventoried and seized before she even stood trial. The fees for her prosecution would be deducted from her assets, ensuring that she literally paid for her own destruction. If she owned land, it would be sold to pay the costs of her trial. If she had debts owed to her, those would be collected by the court. Even her clothing would be stripped from her body and sold, leaving her to face execution in a rough sackcloth provided by the prison. The psychological impact of this systematic looting extended far beyond the immediate victims. Entire communities lived in terror, knowing that a whispered accusation could lead to financial ruin even before any formal charges were filed. Neighbors turned against neighbors, not necessarily out of genuine belief in witchcraft, but because denunciation had become a tool of economic warfare. A merchant could eliminate a competitor by suggesting she consorted with demons. A landlord could seize a tenant's property by claiming supernatural interference with his crops. The witch trial had become the ultimate hostile takeover, disguised as religious purification. The accused, often women of modest means who had accumulated small but significant property through years of careful thrift, had no defense against this legal plunder. They lacked the political connections that might have protected them, the wealth that might have bought them influential advocates, and the social standing that might have made their destruction inconvenient for the powerful. They were, in the coldest possible terms, perfect victims, vulnerable enough to be safely attacked, wealthy enough to make their destruction profitable, and isolated enough to ensure that their elimination would not trigger broader social unrest. The genius of this system lay not just in its efficiency at extracting wealth, but in its ability to present systematic theft as righteous action. The judges who grew rich from witch trials were not seen as criminals, but as heroes, protecting Christian society from supernatural threats. The communities that were impoverished by these proceedings were told they had been purified, cleansed of demonic influence through the sacrifice of their neighbors' lives and property. The victims who died in agony were posthumously transformed into cautionary tales, their suffering reframed as necessary education for those who might be tempted to follow similar paths. As we linger in this grim tableau of calculated cruelty, let the echoes of their cries guide us through the shadows of history. These were not the random victims of superstitious mobs, but the carefully selected targets of a legal system that had discovered how to transform human suffering into gold with the efficiency of an alchemist's furnace. The witch trials were not aberrations of justice, but perfected examples of how power operates when freed from moral constraints, how greed can masquerade as righteousness, and how the machinery of law can be retooled to serve the interests of those who control it. In understanding this dark alchemy of greed and persecution, we begin to comprehend not just a historical phenomenon, but a template for exploitation that would echo through the centuries, appearing whenever those in power discovered new ways to profit from the fears and vulnerabilities of those they were sworn to protect. Now, having traced the economic machinery and legal mechanisms that transformed fear into fortune, we must turn our attention to the human cost of this systematic exploitation. For behind every seized property and judicial fee, behind every legal precedent and theological justification, lay the broken lives of real people. Ordinary souls whose only crime was existing in a world where their vulnerability could be monetized and their suffering transformed into gold. As twilight settles over the medieval village, imagine the flickering firelight casting trembling shadows on the faces of the accused. Women, and sometimes men, branded as witches by a system that had already decided their fate before they ever set foot in a courtroom. These were not the sorcerers of folklore, wielding supernatural powers from hidden lairs deep in enchanted forests. They were ordinary people, widows struggling to maintain their independence in a society that demanded female submission, healers whose knowledge of herbs and human anatomy threatened established hierarchies, mothers and daughters caught in a web of greed and fear that would destroy everything they had built over lifetimes of patient labor. The human cost of the witch hunts was staggering in its scope and devastating in its precision. These campaigns of legalized theft tore apart families and communities while methodically enriching the judges who condemned them. Let us walk among these victims, treading carefully through the shadows of their stories, allowing their experiences to serve as a haunting reminder of the price paid for others' avarice and the human suffering that fueled the wealth of those who perverted justice for profit. The demographic profile of witch trial victims reveals the calculated nature of their selection. Many accused were women living on society's margins, elderly widows with small plots of land that had been left to them by deceased husbands, herbalists whose knowledge of plant medicine threatened the monopoly of male physicians and clergy, or simply outspoken women who defied patriarchal norms by speaking their minds in public spaces. These were not random targets chosen by superstitious mobs, but carefully selected victims whose vulnerabilities had been assessed and whose assets had been cataloged by those who would profit from their destruction. Consider the widow living alone at the edge of the village, her husband dead these 3 years, her children grown and moved away to distant towns. She owns her small cottage outright, a modest inheritance that represents security in an uncertain world. She tends a garden where she grows vegetables for her own table and medicinal herbs that she shares with neighbors when they fall ill. Her knowledge of which plants can ease a fever or calm a colicky infant makes her valuable to the community, but this same knowledge makes her dangerous to those who see opportunity in her isolation. She has no powerful protectors, no influential family members who might intervene on her behalf, no wealth sufficient to buy her way out of trouble. She is, in the coldest possible terms, the perfect victim. The herbalist presents an even more complex case study in the intersection of knowledge, gender, and economic vulnerability. Her understanding of plants and their properties, gathered through years of careful observation and passed down through generations of women, represents a form of power that operates outside official channels. She can ease pain without requiring the services of a physician, assist in difficult births without summoning a priest, and provide remedies that cost a fraction of what the established medical authorities might charge. Her very existence challenges the monopoly of male experts who have claimed exclusive dominion over the healing arts. When accusations of witchcraft arise, they often focus on her knowledge itself, reframing healing as harming, medicine as maleficium, and expertise as evidence of diabolic pacts. The trials themselves were grotesque parodies of justice. Theatrical performances where the outcome was predetermined and the only question was how much suffering could be extracted from the process. Confessions were extracted through torture techniques that would have impressed the most creative sadists of any era. The infamous swimming test involved binding the accused and throwing them into deep water. If they floated, they were guilty of witchcraft. If they sank and drowned, they were posthumously declared innocent. The pricking test searched for supposedly insensitive spots on the body where the devil had touched his servants, using specially designed needles that could be retracted to create the illusion of supernatural intervention. The weeping test observed whether the accused could shed tears, as witches were supposedly incapable of genuine emotion. Evidence in these trials was as flimsy as spider webs and twice as easily manufactured. A neighbor's suspicion that the accused had cast an evil eye on their livestock was sufficient to open an investigation. The discovery of what might be construed as magical implements, unusual stones, dried herbs, or even books provided material evidence of supernatural activities. The testimony of children, often coached by adults with their own agendas, carried the weight of divine revelation. Dreams and visions were accepted as eyewitness accounts of demonic gatherings. The birth of deformed animals or the spoilage of milk could be attributed to the malevolent influence of any woman who had recently quarreled with the affected party. Once convicted, and conviction rates approached mathematical certainty, the accused faced execution by methods specifically chosen to maximize both suffering and public spectacle. Burning at the stake was preferred not only because it was thought to purify the victim's corrupted soul, but because it provided a dramatic conclusion to the legal proceedings that reinforced the power of those who had orchestrated them. The condemned were often strangled before the flames reached them, not out of mercy, but to prevent them from recanting their confessions or crying out accusations against their persecutors. Those who were hanged faced a death that was quicker, but no less public, their bodies left to swing in the wind as warnings to others who might consider challenging the established order. The screams of the dying echoed through village squares where children played and merchants conducted their business, creating a soundscape of terror that permeated daily life. These executions were not merely punishments but advertisements, carefully staged performances designed to demonstrate the consequences of threatening those in power. The smoke rising from the pyres carried more than the scent of burning flesh. It carried the message that resistance was futile, that questioning authority was dangerous, and that the price of independence was death. The families of the accused faced devastation that extended far beyond the loss of their loved ones. Stripped of property that had been confiscated to pay for the trial proceedings, they found themselves thrust into destitution overnight. Children were left orphaned not just by their parents' deaths, but by the destruction of their inheritance. Wives lost not only their husbands but their homes, their savings, their livestock, and their means of survival. The stigma of association with convicted witches followed survivors for generations, making it difficult for them to find employment, arrange marriages, or establish themselves in new communities. The social isolation imposed on survivors was as devastating as their economic destruction. In a world where community support was essential for survival, the families of accused witches found themselves shunned by neighbors who feared contamination by association. Former friends crossed the street to avoid encounters that might attract unwanted attention. Business partnerships dissolved. Marriage prospects evaporated. The web of social relationships that had once provided security and meaning was torn apart by the accusation of witchcraft, leaving survivors to navigate a hostile world without the networks of support that had once sustained them. In some regions, particularly in the German territories during the peak of the witch craze, entire villages were decimated as accusations spiraled into mass hysteria carefully orchestrated by judges eager for profit. The town of Würzburg, under the rule of Prince Bishop Julius Ector, witnessed the execution of over 600 people between 1626 and 1631. The systematic nature of these persecutions reveals their true purpose. Not the elimination of supernatural threats, but the wholesale transfer of wealth from the vulnerable to the powerful through legalized theft disguised as religious purification. Consider the story of Anna Skutsch, a Bavarian woman executed in 1589, whose case exemplifies the personal tragedy hidden behind the bureaucratic language of trial records. Anna was a widow in her 50s who had inherited a small farm from her husband, a plot of land that represented not just her livelihood, but her independence. She had no children to support her, no male relatives to speak for her, no powerful connections to protect her. When accusations of witchcraft surfaced, likely prompted by neighbors who coveted her property or local authorities who saw opportunity in her isolation, she had no defense against the machinery of persecution that ground her life to dust. Her trial followed the established pattern with mechanical precision. Witnesses testified that her cow had produced unusually rich milk, clearly evidence of supernatural enhancement. Neighbors recalled that she had been seen talking to herself while working in her garden, obviously communing with diabolic forces. A child claimed to have seen her flying through the air on a broomstick, a vision that was accepted as credible testimony despite its obvious impossibility. Under torture, Anna confessed to attending midnight Sabbaths where she had consorted with demons and plotted against her Christian neighbors. Her small farm was seized to pay for the costs of her trial. Her modest savings were confiscated to cover the fees of the judges, scribes, and executioners who orchestrated her destruction. Even her few personal possessions, her clothes, her cooking pots, her simple furniture, were sold to satisfy the insatiable appetite of the legal system that had consumed her life. The local magistrate who oversaw her trial used the profits to expand his own land holdings, literally building his wealth on the ashes of her destruction. Anna's story is remarkable only in that it was preserved in court records that survived the centuries. For every Anna Skutsch whose name appears in historical documents, there are countless other women whose lives were erased as completely as their bodies were consumed by flame. These were the unnamed victims whose stories were buried in the ashes of the pyre, whose children were scattered to the winds, whose contributions to their communities were forgotten in the rush to claim their property and profit from their suffering. The psychological impact of the witch hunts extended far beyond their immediate victims. The knowledge that accusation could lead to destruction created a climate of fear that poisoned social relationships and stifled individual expression. Women learned to be invisible, to avoid attracting attention through displays of knowledge, independence, or nonconformity. The elderly isolated themselves rather than risk being seen as threatening. Healers abandoned their practices rather than face accusations of practicing maleficium. The very qualities that made communities resilient, the sharing of knowledge, the support of the vulnerable, the celebration of individual talents, were suppressed by the terror of witch accusations. Yet even in the face of such systematic oppression, the human spirit endured. The accused often faced their tormentors with dignity that shamed their persecutors. They maintained their innocence even under torture, declared their faith even as they were condemned as heretics, and showed compassion for their families even as they faced their own destruction. Their resilience in the face of injustice serves as a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit, even when confronted with the most calculated cruelty. These were not witches, but victims of a system that had discovered how to profit from suffering, that had learned to transform human vulnerability into gold through the alchemy of legal persecution. Their stories remind us that behind every economic system, no matter how sophisticated its justifications or elaborate its procedures, lie real people whose lives are shaped by the choices of those who hold power. As we reflect on their pain, let their quiet strength and enduring courage guide us through the shadows of history, illuminating the human cost of greed and the price of allowing fear to be weaponized for profit. In their memory, we must remember that the witch hunts were not ancient history, but a template for exploitation that appears whenever those in power discover new ways to profit from the fears and vulnerabilities of those they are sworn to protect. Their voices, silenced by flame and rope, still whisper warnings across the centuries, reminding us that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would trade human suffering for gold. As the stars twinkle in the medieval night sky above us, their distant light illuminating the paths we have walked through shadow and flame, we pause to reflect on the enduring legacy of the witch hunts, a dark chapter woven into the very fabric of human history with threads of greed, fear, and calculated cruelty. The invention of witches by judges seeking to transform human suffering into personal wealth left scars that lingered long after the last fires died out, fundamentally shaping our understanding of justice, power, and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of systematic oppression. The witch trials, reaching their terrible crescendo in the late medieval and early modern periods, eventually waned as reason and reform began to challenge superstition and expose the economic machinery that had driven centuries of persecution. Yet the echoes of those accused, condemned, and forgotten continue to resonate through time, their voices rising from the ashes to urge us to learn from the past and guard against the repetition of such calculated cruelty in our own age. The wealth amassed by judges through their systematic exploitation of fear and superstition came at a cost so staggering that its full dimensions remain difficult to comprehend even today. Conservative estimates suggest that between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed during the witch trials across Europe, though many historians believe the actual number was significantly higher. Behind each of these statistics lay a human story, a life cut short, a family destroyed, a community traumatized by the spectacle of legalized murder disguised as divine justice. But the impact extended far beyond the immediate victims to encompass entire generations who lived under the shadow of potential accusation. Their behavior shaped by the knowledge that independence, knowledge, or even simple misfortune could be transformed into evidence of supernatural malevolence. Thousands of lives were lost, not merely in the flames of execution pyres, but in the broader social destruction that accompanied the witch hunts. Communities were shattered as neighbor turned against neighbor, trust dissolved in the acid of suspicion, and the social bonds that had once provided security and meaning were corroded by the knowledge that anyone could become a target. The economic devastation was equally profound, as productive members of society were eliminated and their assets redistributed to those who had orchestrated their destruction. Skilled craftspeople, experienced farmers, knowledgeable healers, all were swept away by a system that valued their property more than their lives. The psychological trauma inflicted by the witch hunts created ripple effects that lasted for generations. Children who witnessed their parents' executions carried those memories into adulthood, creating communities haunted by collective trauma. Women learned to suppress their knowledge and hide their independence, fearful that displaying competence or nonconformity might attract the wrong kind of attention. The very qualities that made societies resilient, the sharing of knowledge, the support of the vulnerable, the celebration of individual talents, were suppressed by the terror of witch accusations, creating a cultural environment where conformity was survival and excellence was dangerous. By the 18th century, the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment began to erode the foundations upon which the witch hunts had been built. Skepticism replaced superstition as educated elites began to question the reliability of torture-extracted confessions and the validity of supernatural explanations for natural phenomena. Legal reforms gradually introduced protections for the accused, requirements for evidence, and limitations on the use of torture. The rise of modern science provided alternative explanations for the mysterious ailments and natural disasters that had once been attributed to malevolent magic. But perhaps most importantly, the economic calculus that had driven the witch hunts began to shift as emerging capitalist structures provided more efficient means of wealth accumulation. The landed aristocracy found more profitable ways to exploit their territories than through the seizure of individual properties. The legal profession discovered that serving the interests of wealthy merchants and emerging industrialists was more lucrative than extorting confessions from impoverished widows. The Church, facing challenges to its authority from Protestant reformers and secular philosophers, could no longer maintain its monopoly on explanations for natural phenomena. The decline of the witch hunts was not the result of a sudden moral awakening, but rather the gradual recognition that the system had become counterproductive. The economic disruption caused by mass executions began to outweigh the profits generated by property seizures. The social instability created by widespread persecution threatened the very foundations of political order. The intellectual credibility of the educated classes was undermined by their association with obviously irrational proceedings. The witch hunts ended not because they were recognized as morally wrong, but because they were no longer economically viable. Yet even as the formal apparatus of which persecution was dismantled, the damage it had inflicted on society proved remarkably durable. Lands that had been redistributed during the trials remained in the hands of those who had acquired them through legal theft. Families that had been broken by accusations never fully recovered their social standing or economic security. The knowledge that had been suppressed, traditional healing practices, agricultural techniques, folklore, and customs, was lost forever as those who had possessed it were eliminated or terrorized into silence. The marginalization of women's roles, which have been both a cause and consequence of the witch hunts, became entrenched in legal and social structures that persisted well into the modern era. The association of female knowledge and independence with supernatural danger created lasting prejudices that influenced everything from property rights to educational opportunities. The traditional roles of women as healers, midwives, and keepers of cultural knowledge were systematically devalued and often transferred to male professionals who claimed greater legitimacy and authority. The story of the witch hunts serves as a powerful reminder of how fear and greed can corrupt even the most sacred institutions, turning the mechanisms of justice into instruments of oppression and the guardians of order into predators who feed on the vulnerability of those they claim to protect. It demonstrates how economic incentives can distort moral reasoning, how institutional authority can be weaponized against the powerless, and how the rhetoric of righteousness can mask the most calculated cruelty. But the legacy of the witch hunts extends beyond its lessons about the corruption of power and the dangers of unchecked authority. It also highlights the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit, the capacity of individuals to maintain their dignity and integrity even in the face of systematic oppression. The accused who faced their tormentors with courage, who refused to betray their principles even under torture, who showed compassion for their families even as they faced their own destruction. These individuals demonstrate that the human capacity for goodness cannot be entirely extinguished, even by the most sophisticated systems of persecution. Their stories, preserved in court records and historical accounts, serve as testimonies to the enduring power of truth over propaganda, of human dignity over systematic dehumanization, of individual courage over collective cowardice. They remind us that even in the darkest periods of human history, there were those who refused to be broken, who maintained their humanity in the face of inhumane treatment, who chose to die with integrity rather than live with compromise. The witch hunts also left a complex legacy in terms of legal and political institutions. The recognition that torture could produce unreliable confessions led to gradual reforms in criminal procedure that emphasized the importance of evidence over coercion. The understanding that mass hysteria could corrupt judicial proceedings contributed to the development of legal protections for the accused and requirements for rational deliberation. The observation that economic incentives could distort legal outcomes influenced the creation of systems designed to insulate judges from direct financial involvement in the cases they decided. These institutional innovations, born from the recognition of past abuses, became foundations for modern concepts of due process, individual rights, and the presumption of innocence. The witch hunts, through their very extremity, helped to define the boundaries of acceptable legal practice and the minimal standards of human dignity that must be maintained even in the pursuit of justice. In this sense, the victims of the witch hunts contributed to the development of legal protections that would benefit future generations, their suffering serving as a catalyst for reforms that might not have occurred otherwise. The cultural impact of the witch hunts proved equally enduring, influencing literature, art, and popular imagination for centuries to come. The figure of the witch, originally crafted by medieval judges as a tool for economic exploitation, was transformed by successive generations into a symbol of resistance against oppression, of feminine power challenging patriarchal authority, of the outsider confronting conformist society. From the Gothic novels of the 18th century to the feminist reclamations of the 20th century, the witch evolved from a justification for persecution into an icon of rebellion and independence. This cultural transformation reflects humanity's ongoing struggle to make sense of historical trauma and to find meaning in past suffering. The witch hunts, which began as calculated exercises in economic exploitation, became in memory a story about the eternal conflict between power and vulnerability, between conformity and independence, between fear and courage. The victims who were destroyed as supposed threats to Christian society were reimagined as martyrs to human freedom, their deaths transformed from meaningless waste into meaningful sacrifice. The modern revival of interest in witchcraft and paganism, while often disconnected from historical reality, reflects a continuing need to reclaim the knowledge and power that was suppressed during the witch hunts. The contemporary celebration of herbalism, midwifery, and traditional healing practices represents an attempt to recover the wisdom that was lost when the witch hunts eliminated those who possessed it. The modern emphasis on feminine spirituality and goddess worship can be understood as a response to the systematic devaluation of women's roles that was both cause and consequence of the witch persecutions. Yet even as we honor the memory of the victims and celebrate their resilience, we must remain vigilant against the tendency to romanticize their suffering or to imagine that the dynamics that drove the witch hunts have been permanently eliminated from human society. The fundamental elements that made the witch hunts possible, economic inequality, institutional corruption, social prejudice, and the human capacity for self-deception, remain present in our contemporary world. The techniques for manufacturing consent, for transforming victims into villains, for disguising economic exploitation as moral necessity, continue to evolve and adapt to new circumstances. The witch hunts remind us that civilization is a fragile achievement, that the institutions designed to protect human dignity can be corrupted and weaponized against the very people they claim to serve. They demonstrate that educated, sophisticated societies are not immune to systematic cruelty, that religious faith can be distorted to justify the most irreligious behavior, that legal systems can be manipulated to serve illegal purposes. They show us that the price of freedom is indeed eternal vigilance, and that the defense of human dignity requires constant effort and unwavering commitment. As we close this journey through the shadows of history, we must carry with us the lessons learned from those who suffered and died in the witch hunts. Their legacy is not merely a historical curiosity, but a living call to action, urging us to question authority when it serves itself rather than justice, to protect the marginalized when they become convenient targets for scapegoating, and to seek truth even when it is more comfortable to embrace familiar lies. Let us honor the memory of Anna Skutch and the countless others whose names have been lost to time, whose property was stolen, whose lives were destroyed, whose courage was tested in the flames of persecution. Their voices, silenced by those who profited from their suffering, still speak to us across the centuries, reminding us that the choice between complicity and resistance, between comfort and conscience, between profit and principle, is one that every generation must make anew. As you drift into sleep tonight, imagine their strength flowing through time to reach you, their quiet defiance inspiring your own commitment to justice, their enduring spirit lighting the way toward a future where such systematic cruelty becomes impossible. Let their stories lull you into dreams of a world where justice triumphs over greed, where the vulnerable are protected rather than exploited, where the pursuit of truth takes precedence over the accumulation of wealth. May their echoes guide you through the night and into a tomorrow where the lessons of the past inform the choices of the present, ensuring that the sacrifices of the witch hunt victims were not made in vain. Their legacy lives on not in the wealth that was stolen from them, but in the wisdom that their suffering has given us. In their memory, we must commit ourselves to building a world where such calculated cruelty becomes impossible, where the mechanisms of justice serve all people rather than the privileged few, and where the human dignity they maintained even in death becomes the foundation upon which all future societies are built.